here. In grad school, I became a Christian, and that's also a part of my life. And so a big issue has been, are those things compatible? Right. So I've talked a lot of this subject in various podcast formats and things like that, but I think this might be either the first or most of the second talk like this that I've given. So there's lots of ways I was trying to scope out for this title. So I'm going to go for an hour here, and then we'll save about 15 minutes at the end for your questions. So clearly this is a big topic, and I have to just pick and choose. So let's get right into it. Okay, first of all, let's clarify some terminology. So in this talk, when I say anarchist, strictly speaking, it is a type of anarchism that in the literature is referred to as anarcho-capitalism. The idea being is people who believe in a market economy and privatization, but they take it to the extreme. Okay, so you're probably familiar with somebody who might be in favor of, hey, I don't think there should be so-called public schools. I think education should be handled in the private sector. And so they don't want the government involved in schools. And you can say, okay, but there's pros and cons, and you can the debate over that seems reasonable. Someone might want to privatize the roads. You might think, well, gee, how would that work? But okay, there's pros and cons. But there's a group that they want to privatize even police services and military defense. So if you saw my talk last night, that's what that was all about. Like, how could that work? And so those people, they refer to themselves as anarcho-capitalists. And the reason they put the capitalist on there is to distinguish themselves from, there's like anarcho-socialists, or historically people might have just referred to themselves as anarchists, but they were either outright Marxist or some other type of version of communist or socialist more generally, because they thought private property was a hierarchical structure, that the capitalists were in bed with the government, and like in order to have factory owners and big banks and stuff like that, you had to have the violent state there to enforce those rules. And in a more free, open society with no rulers, with no state apparatus, you would have socialism. That's how those people thought. So that's not the tradition I'm coming out of. That would be anarcho-socialist. This is anarcho-capitalism. Another term that gets thrown around a lot in this literature and in this movement that I'm in is libertarian. So here, there's different types of ways of defining it, but a lot of people, they subscribe to what does it mean to be libertarian with a small L, not the party, but like the philosophy or the ethical framework. And so somebody who endorses what's called the non-aggression principle, or sometimes abbreviated the NAP, and that says it is immoral to initiate aggression against someone else. Okay, so it's not pacifism. It's not saying you're not allowed to use violence, but you can't use it. You can't have the initiation of that. So if someone's breaking into your house, the standard libertarian says you have the right to shoot the guy ultimately. But the point is, you obviously can't go break into someone else's house. But then also there's implications of this. That, for example, something like drug legalization, a standard libertarian position on that, against small L, not talking about the party per se, is to say, yeah, as a general rule, the government shouldn't punish somebody for selling heroin, certainly not to an adult, because hey, someone taking heroin, you can say that's immoral. You can say it's unethical. You can say you're a bad, father or husband or something if you're addicted to heroin. But that shouldn't be illegal because you're not violating anybody's rights. You're not initiating aggression against somebody. And so therefore, if you believe in the NAP, it would be also immoral for the rest of society to say to you, we're going to throw you in a cage if we catch you doing that. Okay, because there you initiate aggression. Right? So that's how that works. And you can see how a lot of standard libertarian policy views flow out of that. And so to connect it with the anarchism, the anarcho-capitalists say, hey, we're libertarians. We're just consistent about it. Or there's a joke that says, what's the difference between a libertarian and an ANCAP? About 6 months. I think that's the joke. Okay, so the idea being, once you accept libertarianism and the non-aggression principle, and you see how, well, yeah, the government shouldn't be throwing people in jail for using heroin, then it starts to say, well, does taxation make sense? Right? Because isn't that, if there's a otherwise law-abiding person that even the government stipulates, this person hasn't broken any rules, they're not bank robbers, they haven't mugged anybody, they're not a rapist, they're not a murderer, it's just, April 15th came and went, and they didn't send in their tax due, that they're, the idea from an ANCAP perspective, flowing out of libertarianism, is to say, well, if they didn't violate anybody's rights, how can you just say you owe us a bunch of money, or else we throw you in jail? Right? So that's the idea. So anarcho-capitalists think that's the logical extension of the non-aggression principle. Okay, so having said all that, you might be surprised then to learn that I don't anymore, and I came to this view 3 or 4 years ago. I stopped referring to myself as an anarchist, whereas before I had no problem saying that. And it was a twofold reason. So on the one hand, there was a lot of baggage associated with the term. And so a lot of people thought, and I'll get to this in a minute, historically, like I said, there's been different ways that the word has been used, and it was just, I would spend too much time trying to clarify, so I stopped leading with that. But then also I thought there was a more substantive issue, that when I became a Christian, I said, well, isn't there a sense in which I'm a monarchist, right? Because Jesus is the King of Kings. And so there's a sense in which I believe in a monarchy, it's just I don't believe in a human should fill that role. And so that's another reason, like I said, more substantively, that I stopped answering. But if I'm at like a conference with a bunch of libertarians and someone comes up and says, hey, Dr. Murphy, are you an anarchist? I'll say yes, because I know what they mean. They're trying to say, are you merely a minarchist who believes in a night watchman state, or do you go for the full Monty and think, no, get rid of the state altogether? That's what they're asking me, so that's why I would say yes, I'm an anarchist, because I know that's what they mean. But like on my Twitter bio or something, I don't call myself an anarchist. Okay, the last sort of terminological clarification here, and then we'll get into more substantive things, is people in this sort of conversation a lot of times will say, oh yeah, I don't like the government, or I want to get rid of the government with a small g, and other people will complain about that, and they'll say, no, like, when they know what my view is, they'll say, Bob, you're not against the government. That broadly construed, government just means, like, there's authority figures, and they issue rulings, and then there are people that subscribe to that jurisdiction and abide by those rulings. That's a government. So I might say the family is the household family unit is a government, and the parents are in charge. And maybe some people, especially if they have a biblical framework, they might even say that the husband is the leader of the family, and so forth. Okay. Or if you go to a certain type of church, there might be church elders, and maybe some guy in the congregation is cheating on his wife, and everybody knows it, and the elders pull him aside and say, you got to stop doing that. He says, mind your own business, we're in love. And it just keeps going. Eventually, they kick him out of the church. Okay, so a lot of people would have no problem referring to that as, oh yeah, there's a government of the church. So I'm okay with those social structures. And so again, it may, just so you guys know where I'm coming from in this talk, it may be helpful for me to clarify and say, if the sense in which I'm an anarchist and for anarchy means I don't agree with a political state with a capital S, whereas if government just means what I said, then yes, I'm okay with the existence of government in that sense. But also, you guys get what I mean. If somebody says like, oh yeah, I don't like the government, they're not talking about their church, they're not talking about their parents. They mean the institution that finds me on April 15th, or if I drive too fast, pulls me over and says that, you know, take this breathalyzer or whatever, you get what I'm saying, right? Or that ultimately can draft me and send me to war. That's who you mean colloquially when you say the government. Okay. There's also, as I say, so in this discussion, just to be again clear where I'm coming from, there's two types of anarchists. So one is, again, the historical, I don't know if you can read it, but that's a political cartoon. And then it says European anarchist here. I think this is probably like an old-timey cartoon. I just got this from Google. And it says, coming to me, impressed. Right, and so it's obviously some American, probably like what we call a nativist, who was against unrestricted immigration at the time, whenever this was written or drawn, and saying, we gotta watch out for those European anarchists. And so they're, the cliche or the stereotype is the bomb-throwing anarchist. And there really were people like that, right? So people didn't invent that. There really were self-described anarchists who were engaged in what we call political terrorism, including bomb throwing. That makes sense, right? They didn't believe in the state, so what do? If you think some violent institutions causing war and mass oppression and poverty and starvation, get rid of it. So let's make some bombs, right? That's obviously not what I'm endorsing in this talk. Another way, though, of seeing it more colloquially and nowadays is, even among self-described anarcho-capitalists, there is a certain type of person who's attracted to that philosophy because they think, I don't want anyone imposing their rules on me. They don't believe in authority per se. And a lot of times these people are atheists, right? Which kind of makes sense psychologically. If you're an atheist, then you're probably more likely to be someone who thinks, I don't want some external authority figure imposing their rules of conduct on me. I'm my own person. I'm self-sovereign. So there are a lot of people like that who are attracted to libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism more specifically. And so that's why they like it, because they don't think rules should apply to them. They, oh, there's no authority figure higher than me, is the mentality. And so that's why they're attracted to them. And there's plenty of people like that among the ranks of modern self-described anarcho-capitalists. But there's another strand. So this is Murray Rothbard, in case you don't know. So he was one of the leading theorists in the modern anarcho-capitalist tradition. He was an economist, was his training, but he wrote a lot of political philosophy. So Rothbard, by the way, also was technically an atheist, but a lot of his associates were Catholic primarily, and Rothbard had a lot of respect for like the natural law tradition, through the works of like Aquinas and things like that, and the early church fathers. And so Rothbard respected the church as an institution, the Catholic Church as an institution. It was sort of like a bulwark against the state, and again, liked the natural law tradition coming out of that framework. And so somebody like Rothbard, the reason he was an anarchist wasn't because he didn't think, there shouldn't be rules applying to anybody, and how dare the state try to impose rules on people. That's not where he was coming from. He was coming from the other way, saying no one is above the law, including politicians and soldiers and judges and police and people working for the IRS. And so the way Rothbard viewed it, the reason he was against the things that the modern state, again with a capital S, does, is because he said those are things that are inherently immoral. If we in our private lives did a lot of the things that people think are the purview of the state, it would clearly be a crime. So what's the military draft? That's slavery. You grab a bunch of people, say you're going to go do some work for us, which involves things that you might think are horribly immoral. You'll kill some people over there, and if you don't, we're going to throw you in a cage or shoot you or whatever for desertion. Right? So that's clearly, private individuals can't act like that. What is taxation? You may have seen the memes going on saying taxation is theft. So again, regardless of what you think is done with the money and the benefits of that, the idea is, no, in my private capacity, if a bunch of neighbors and I come together and say, hey, we think everybody should chip in $100 a month to have a soup kitchen, some crotchety old guy down the street says, no, I don't want to, you can't just go and take it out of his bank account and say it's for a good cause. That's theft. You can't do that. You have to convince people, and if you take their money against their will, that's theft. You can't do it. But yeah, isn't that the essence of taxation? And it doesn't, again, in a private setting, it doesn't change things. It just a majority votes for it. Okay, so that's kind of the argument. Or something like jury duty. Isn't that also for slavery? All right, so all kinds of things that the government state does all the time. Rothbard's point is the only reason they get away with that is because we have this weird thing in our conventional value system where stuff that would be wrong for us to do is okay for agents of the state to do. So again, so he's coming at it not saying I'm an anarchist because no rules. He's saying no, because I believe in these rules, that's why I think they should apply to everybody. That nobody is above the law. Okay, so you can see both types of people, personality types and ethical views, are attracted to the libertarian movement in the United States. That's where we're most familiar with it. And like I say, I can talk to these, but I can tell that even though they all like the writings of Murray Rothbard, they do their ultimate motivations are actually pretty far apart in terms of where they're coming from. Okay. So it's just real quickly, I'll give you a short version of my own views, not because it's particularly relevant to this talk, but again, just so you can more understand where I'm coming from, particularly for those of you who are yourselves religious. Just this might help you understand, some of the stuff I say later. You might be able to, put me into a box if that helps you just categorize where I'm coming from. Okay, so I was raised, that's not a picture of me, that's off Google. I was raised Catholic, and if you're familiar with the Catholic Church and the sacrament, I got confirmed. Okay, if you're familiar with that, that's the extent that I went through. And then in high school, and particularly going into undergrad, also not a picture of me, that's Richard Feynman. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He wrote a couple of pop books, real funny guy, brilliant physicist, but also very irreverent about religious topics, didn't believe in God, thought that stuff was superstitious. So he was kind of my idol, like in junior high, and I wanted to become a physicist, and I wrote to be like him. And so that's where I abandoned my childhood traditions and faith, and I called myself a devout atheist. I was very clever. In fact, in undergrad, I started to research to write the definitive refutation of Christianity. Right? So just where I was coming from at that point, because I had read some stuff on atheism and thought H.L. Mencken has a book called The Treatise on the Gods, and there was a guy, George Smith, a libertarian, who had a book called, I think it was called Atheism. Just to give you a flavor, so Smith would say things like, he would make arguments appealing to libertarians, saying, I don't believe in the existence of the God of the Bible, but isn't that a good thing? Because there's no worse tyrant who's ever been imagined in fiction than the God of the Old Testament, right? And even in the New Testament version, where he's kinder and gentler still, the basic Christian doctrine is, hey, I created everything, and you better love me, or you're going to roast in hell forever. And gee, aren't you glad that being doesn't exist? Right? That's kind of the argument he was getting. Okay, so I understood that. I liked where they were coming from, but I thought I could take it deeper. I was going to. Oh, and also Thomas Paine, who I loved, for political reasons. You may know him. He wrote a lot of real stirring stuff in the Revolutionary War. Washington would have his men, like the captains, read Thomas Paine's writings to get the troops all riled up and ready to fight. He also wrote a book called The Age of Reason, where he went through and tried to systematically. So Paine wasn't an atheist; he was a deist, but he didn't believe in Christianity. He thought Christianity was an abomination that was like sacrilegious towards the true God, which was this disembodied force that created things in the beginning that kind of set the clockwork in motion. Right? And so he went through and tried to point out contradictions in the gospel accounts and stuff like that. Right? So I thought, I like what you guys told me, I was going to write a definitive refutation. That's where I was as a undergrad, excuse me. And then I won't, have time to sort of, again, I'm focusing on substance things besides my personal odyssey, but in grad school I had a lot of stuff that happened. I ended up accepting Jesus, and I now refer to myself as a Bible-believing Christian. So some of my, one of my heroes or guys I look to as a spiritual guy is R.C. Sproul, guy on top. I love to listen to his lectures and sermons on various topics. Everything he says, but most of what he says, if you know him, that's probably where I'm coming from. And then this is actually Luis Molina, who was a member of the School of Salamanca, and so I knew him back when I was an atheist. He's one of the early contributors to economic science. Back then, there wasn't the same field of economics, just learned men would write all kinds of stuff, and so he wrote a bunch of stuff on, we would now say, oh, that's a precursor of Austrian economics, so that's how I knew of him. But he also wrote on theological matters, and has a very interesting way of trying to reconcile God's sovereignty with human free will. Okay, so again, I had been grappling with that question philosophically, and I did some podcast episodes on it, so people emailed me and said, it looks like you kind of reinvented Molinism, go check out. But they were right, that I had stumbled upon a framework that this guy. So if you know that stuff, you say that's where I'm coming from. And I've seen the Q&A if you want to pursue this. Feel free. Okay. Another sort of, warning or disclaimer with this stuff is, I try to personally be very, very careful in not allowing my political, ideological views to color my interpretation of the Bible, let's say. And so this is something that C.S. Lewis warned about. So the point of mere Christianity, in the beginning of the reading, I was like, why is he titling it? Because he was saying, I am a mere Christian, meaning Lewis at the time he wrote this was lamenting the fact that there were a lot of political movements that the people would try to append it to Christianity, like to say, oh, if you're a Christian, you should be a pacifist, if the people were against entry into the Second World War, stuff like that. Or if you're a Christian, you should be a socialist, and that's why you should support redistribution programs to feed the poor. If you're a good Christian, and so there are a lot of political activists who were wearing their Christianity on their sleeve as a way of bolstering support for their pet cause. And obviously Lewis's point is, no, if you're a Christian, Jesus is your Lord, and that's really who you are. So one way I sort of tease some of my colleagues, if people call themselves a Christian libertarian, I'll say, well, shouldn't you call yourself a libertarian Christian? Okay, so anyway, that's just, again, with this talk, I get, sometimes I'm almost a bit squeamish, like mixing these things together, but on the other hand, I am, a member of both camps, the libertarian anarcho-capitalists and Christians, and a lot of people think that they're contradictory, and so that's what I'm going to now do in the remaining time here, is try to explain to you why I don't think they're actually contradictory. Okay, so here, I promise for those of you who saw my talk last night, there's only maybe 2 slides here that are repetition from last night and starting right now, but I have to go through this just for people who only showed up to this one, just to kind of know where I'm coming from and how I'm trying, what it is I'm trying to reconcile with Christianity. Okay, so the big thing in terms of anarcho-capitalism, and my views on this stuff are, how could you have market-based a court system and police ruling, or police and law enforcement, stuff like that. And so this is the framework of the system. There's a dispute. Instead of picking up the phone and calling the cops, there's no such organization, there's just entity. What do you do? If they can't work it out themselves, they take their dispute to a third party. And so the essential element of that process is both people agree on the front end to submit their dispute to the discretion or the opinion of this third party. And the only way that can work is that there's a group of arbitrators who have a reputation for fairness and integrity. Otherwise they wouldn't get business, because both parties have to agree ahead of time. Yeah, I think this guy's got a reputation for fairness. I think I'm in the right in this dispute. Yeah, I'm willing to submit our case to this guy. Right? So that's not the basic framework. But again, in this system, it's not that the judge has some authority over you and is issuing an edict. They're literally just rendering an opinion. Say this is the body of law, or even more, in a more decentralized fashion, there's competing law codes floating around, and the people in a dispute specify ahead of time, we agree, we want our disagreement to be settled according to this type of rule book. And then you're the judge applying these rules to our particular situation here, because the rules are sort of general and abstract. Real world cases are very messy, and so it takes a judge who's an expert in that rule system to apply it in this case. All right? And so there doesn't need to be one rule book for everybody in a certain geographical region. The idea is people can have different ones that they subscribe to, and as long as everybody in a particular dispute can agree on a particular code that's going to be used to settle it, that's all you need. It doesn't need to be the same code for every single dispute, but why would you need that? You don't need that. As long as everybody can resolve their disputes this way, that's conducive to a functioning, peaceful society. Right? So that's kind of my vision of how this would happen in practice if you didn't have a monopoly state in charge of the courts and the law, and then having a police agency that enforces all that stuff. Okay, and then the point that I walked through more carefully last night was to say, in this system, even though, especially if you're just hearing me for the first time today, that might sound like, whoa, it sounds like there'd be all kinds of different rules floating around. I think in practice, there actually would be a systematic rule of law in a region that obeyed these principles even more than there is right now in the world dominated by states. But right now, if you commit a certain type of crime in Alabama versus California, there might be different penalties that happen based on where you're located. So it's not that there's the same rules applicable in the U.S. And certainly if you cross into Mexico or Canada, the rules are a lot different, even more so, right? So yet most people who think you need a state to provide law and order, they don't think we need one world government, right? So it's interesting. So well, why not? If you're okay with there being a different government system and different rules in the U.S., 50 U.S. states, and certainly going from the U.S. to Germany, if you're okay with that and you don't think that that's going to be just pure anarchy, well then, what's the problem with this kind of system? Okay, so anyway, that's kind of the framework where I'm coming from. And then one last component of it, and then we'll jump into the, how you reconcile this with standard Christianity. The question, okay, the kind of framework I just walked through, would there be, so I told you kind of what the free market, private sector analog of judges would be. I skipped over some of this discussion here, but what would be the free market voluntary analog of law enforcement or police? I think there'd be competing companies. I don't think they would be heavily armed. I think they would, in most cases, try to apprehend suspects without hurting anybody. I don't think you'd see high-speed car chases, like, there's some crazy videos floating around now on Twitter or Facebook, that some guy does something, robs a bank, let's say, and there's 15 police cars chasing him on the interstate, he's doing it, and the police end up, hitting some, this recently happened, like smashed in, or hit a car, and that car went spinning, and some lady was crossing the street with a baby stroller. All right, I'll stop telling you what happened, but it wasn't pretty. Okay, so lots of stuff like I don't think that would happen in this kind of a system. That wouldn't be good for business. Right, somebody robbed a bank. I think they'd have mechanisms in place where they could trace that stuff better and just isolate the person. Have private detectives figure out who it is. And there'll be other mechanisms in place to try to use boycotts and whatever to isolate them, as opposed to high-speed car chases that are killing pedestrians. That's crazy. Okay, so anyway, that's kind of the framework. But then for this slide, to say, all right, I guess I can see how that might work. I understand where you're coming from, Murphy. But what about prisons? Would there be some voluntary analog of a prison? So the way I think this kind of thing would be handled. And again, I'm just walking through this to then say, this kind of a system, how would that fare vis-a-vis standard Christian doctrines? I think, yeah, there might be things that we, with our vantage point, if we were transported into a society that followed these principles or practices, we might look at that building and say, oh, that's a prison, that's what that is. And so how it would arise is, I think, because for one thing, every parcel of land in this kind of a society would have an owner, private owner. It might be joint, like it might be a company that owns it, and there's a bunch of shareholders who together own the company, that sort of thing. But there wouldn't be public property. The way right now, if you say who owns the sidewalks or who owns the main street or the interstate, things like that, people say the government does. And so you could say the taxpayers or the people collectively, but you get the idea. Whereas who owns a particular restaurant, you say, oh, that's Jim Smith owns that, or the such and such corporation owns that restaurant. And so in a privatized society, every bit of land, there were sidewalks, the owners of particular stretches would all have an individual specific owner. And that person would have the legal right to set whatever rules they want on their property. And, stuff like, is there smoking or not? Stuff like that. Can you have guns on the property? All that kind of stuff, which would be the owner can set the rules. And then I think it'd be pretty standard that one of the rules would be, if you're convicted in a reputable court, meaning that people brought evidence before a reputable judge who's got, a track record of fairness and competence in these types of rulings, and has a lot of experience, and somebody brings a bunch of evidence saying, we think this guy's a serial killer. Now, there's been a bunch of bodies turning up, and we have evidence pointing to this guy being a killer in at least 3 of the cases. It's pretty open and shut, and the guy's on the run and gets notified, hey, we're going to try your case. Do you want to show up? Do you want to get a lawyer? And he says, no, you're all a bunch of crooks. I didn't do anything. Okay, he gets convicted in absentia, is what the term would be. So the community is now put on alert, hey, this guy walking around, we think he's a serial killer. So we don't have to go through, a lot of libertarian treatises go through like the wrestling with, gee, can we just drive up and grab that guy and throw him in a cage? And because libertarians, they want to be concerned with the ethical use of violence or force against people. So they spend a lot of time. And so my take is, I think we can sidestep that. It doesn't matter. We don't need to wrestle with the question, are you allowed to grab a convicted criminal and put him against his will into the back of a paddy wagon and drive down and throw him in a cage? That doesn't matter, because everybody in the area who knows this is a convicted serial killer can just say, you can't stand on my property, get off. But if everybody in the whole area says that, he has nowhere to stand. Okay, so make sure you follow my argument. Clearly, it's within your rights as a property owner to say, I don't want you on my land, you have to get out. Right? If you're not seeing it, just imagine your own house. Right? Clearly, if someone wants to come in and sit down at your dinner table, you can say, no, get out. And it's not your job to say why. If they say, what did I do? You can just say, I don't want you in my house, get out. Right? And that's most people agree right now in the real world, you have the right to do that legally. So saying, okay, just extend that. If every bit of land is owned by somebody in this kind of a framework, you have the right to say who can be on your land. And I think pretty clearly, most people in the community, if the guy's literally a convicted serial killer, say you can't stay here. Okay, but if everybody's doing that, he's a pariah, where's he going to go? And so I think there would be a role for institutions that would arise that would say, if you're a pariah that no one else wants you, you can come stay here. And they might be either motivated by altruistic religious reasons, maybe like a home for wayward people, and we know that God forgives everybody. Saul was a murderer, and God used him, and so we don't condemn you. We're sinners as well. Come here and we'll work with you. Whatever. Or it could be a for-profit institution that just says, hey, we know no one else wants to house you. You come here. We're going to have rules. When you first get in here, we're going to have like a container.